The relationship today between Russia and the West is probably at its lowest level since the worst days of the Cold War. And I'd like to go into that and explain why this has happened, as I understand it. But I would like to begin by saying one important thing. I represent nobody but myself. I have not come here to speak in Mr. Putin's behalf or in the behalf of opposition to Mr. Putin. I'm a journalist. I try to be as even-handed as I possibly can be. And I'd like you to understand that, because for me it's very important. I don't know how many of you are familiar with a man by the name of George Kennan. He was probably one of the most brilliant statesmen of 20th century America, and he was the man who formulated the policy of containment vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. He wrote an article many, many, many years ago, signed X simply, stating how the United States and the West in general should try to handle Soviet expansion. And the word he used was containment, contain Soviet Union. And that became the backbone of American policy. And when I say American, by that I mean Western policy, because let's face it, ever since the end of World War II, U.S. policy has pretty much dominated what is called Western policy in general. So this man, George Kennan, who died relatively not long ago, I think he was 103 when he passed away, was called up by one of the observers of the New York Times in May of 1998. Now you may recall that in 1998, the United States took the decision, it was actually President Clinton who took the decision, to enlarge NATO and to include some of the countries that had previously been in the Soviet bloc. And these were Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary. So this New York Times observer called up Mr. Kennan and asked him what he thought about this decision. And I'm going to read to you what Mr. Kennan said. I think, he said, it is the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it is a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this expansion whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. What bothers me is how superficial and ill-informed the whole Senate debate was. I was particularly bothered by the references to Russia as a country dying to attack Western Europe. Don't people understand? Our differences in the Cold War were with the Soviet communist regime. Now, we're turning our backs on the very people who mounted the greatest bloodless revolution in history to remove that Soviet regime. I repeat, he said this in 1998. This was well after Gorbachev had come to power in 1985, and then had lost power in 1991, and this was the time of Boris Yeltsin. Now, I have interviewed Mr. Gorbachev 3 times, and each time I have asked him specifically, were you given any guarantees at all that NATO would not move eastward? Because after all, NATO was created because of what was considered to be the possible Soviet threat. NATO was and remains a military alliance to protect each other back then from a possible Soviet attack. All for one and one for all, if you wish. But then the Soviet Union disappeared. There was no more Soviet Union. And there was no more Warsaw Pact, which was the countries of the Soviet bloc put together. Why would you need NATO? Against who? Who's the enemy in that case? And so I've asked Gorbachev, I say 3 times, did you get any kind of guarantee that NATO would not move eastward? And 3 times he said to me, yes, I was given an oral guarantee. I was given a guarantee by Secretary of State James Baker that if we allowed Germany to reunify, if we allowed the Berlin Wall to come down, NATO would not move 1 inch eastward. Germany reunified, the wall came down, and for several years, NATO did not move eastward. But then, during the Clinton period, it did. Yeltsin, when this decision was taken and he was president of Russia, asked the American side, didn't we have an agreement? And you know what they told him? They said, no. We had an agreement with the Soviet Union. You're Russia. We never had an agreement with you. Today's relationship, which I repeat is probably as bad as at any time after World War II, in my opinion, comes from this. NATO is seen by Russia as threatening. Now, you may argue that NATO is a defensive organization and that the Russians shouldn't be afraid of it. Well, they are afraid of it. One of the reasons for the whole Ukrainian debacle is the fear of the Russian government that should Ukraine be allowed to go west, in general terms, then NATO will appear on Russia's southwest border. NATO has already appeared on Russia's border in such countries as Estonia and Latvia, which have a common border with Russia. Now, I often say, and I say this to Americans because I usually speak to Americans, I say, imagine for a moment, imagine the map. Now, the map of the United States, I think all of you can easily imagine, and you know where Mexico is vis-a-vis the U.S. Perhaps the map of Russia is a bit more complex for you, but basically, Ukraine lies vis-a-vis Russia pretty much like Mexico lies vis-a-vis the United States. Now, imagine that there is a revolution in Mexico. It's not that hard to imagine. And imagine that it's anti-American, which is also not that difficult to imagine. And then imagine that this new Mexican government, which is somewhat fearful of Big Brother to the north, invites Russian troops to be on the border with the United States, just in case. You think the United States would allow this? 2 independent countries, Mexico and Russia, have the right to make this kind of agreement. The United States would certainly not. Just as it did not allow Russia to deploy missiles in Cuba. It said no. It said, we'll declare war if you do this.